I was going to talk a little bit about the, what we've called Beyond the Stopbanks. As Celine mentioned, I'm a member of the Rivers Group. I've been on the executive and was a founder member of the Rivers Group, and really proud to have established that and really appreciate everybody's support on this. I think it's a valuable conduit to get a range of different people with an interest in rivers, not just river engineers. It's really trying hard to get all those other people who have other interests in rivers so that we can all have a joined up conversation about how we live with our rivers and manage the hazards and the good parts and the bad parts from them. So as well as that, I also have a role as manager of flood protection at Greater Wellington Regional Council, and then within that role I then also have a role as the convener of the New Zealand River Managers Group. So that is a group that represents all of the river managers across New Zealand, and as a collegial but also as a professional body to help join the group together and try and get some consistency across New Zealand as to how we undertake our work. So with that, I'll skip through the presentation. I had a couple of videos there that don't look as though they're going to work, so I'll have to speak to those, unfortunately. But I think probably best really would appreciate questions. I operate very, very happily answering questions. So if I skip through the presentation relatively quickly and then come back and answer the questions. So the river manager's perspective, putting it into 4 areas at the moment, just a little bit of a historical perspective, because I think it's useful to help people understand where we've been coming from, looking at some of the challenges that we see as a group, how we've responded to those challenges, and then a bit more about the up-to-date stuff, which some people might be interested in, is about some of the government response to that. So firstly, that historical perspective, and this is where I was going to play a nice little video that we've had there. That really gave a sense far better than I can by speaking to people about where these schemes came from. They came from a period of just after the war, a real desire for development and growth in New Zealand, and looking at how we could push back those boundaries and utilise all of the available land to make people safer and to encourage economic development. And the little video clip that I've got there just really helps you understand the language and the science and the things that were going on in those days along that line. We then got through from that, so those schemes established by catchment boards starting in the early 50s and through into the mid-80s, pretty much stopped around the mid-80s when the government suddenly ran out of money and the checkbook went into the red, so they had to stick it in the top drawer and stop funding stuff, and flood protection was one of those things that they stopped funding. And we continued on maintaining those assets, but maintaining them as they were put in place in many respects in the 1950s and 60s. So we did a stock take in 2018, 2019. That was called Hiding in Plain Sight, because much of that infrastructure that we've got there is hidden away. No one would even really know it's there. So Tonkin and Taylor helped us put that report together, and it gave us a great sort of, as it says, a stock take of where we're up to today. Again, trying to summarise that in a relatively quick way is quite difficult, but the graphic here, map of New Zealand, the dark blue bits over the maps of New Zealand is basically where all of the different schemes are around the country. And there's about 350 of those schemes across the country. They cover something like 5-6% of New Zealand, but a much higher proportion of what's the very good arable land. And then if you look at the graphics out the side, if you look at the Canterbury one, comes out the side there, there's a little dark blue dot on one side, and that's the cost of running those schemes on an annual basis. And the great big lighter blue shade on the other side is the value that they bring to the communities and to the country as a whole within which they sit. So you can see that with all of those schemes, compared to the cost of running them, they provide incredibly good value for money for the country. and something on an average of about 50 to 1. So for every dollar you spend on a flood protection scheme, you're getting about $50 worth of value back to the country. So that's a sort of a little bit of background of where the schemes are, the hiding in plain sight. The stock take really showed that the schemes have been incredibly good value for money, and they'll continue to provide some good value for money. But there's some quite significant challenges out there. Talked about the climate change in here, iwi partnerships, environmental considerations, different standards, community expectations. Even the legislative changes are all going to throw us a fair amount of challenge. This one showing a little bit of the climate change challenge. This is a graphic from the Hutt River, and the scheme currently designed for a 440-year return period level of protection. So if you come across from the red dotted line, you go across to the solid red line, and that sets you on the return period things at about 440, and based on the current hydrology. But if you start looking at future hydrology, which is what the grey shaded areas above that are, you'll see that in 50 to 100 years' time, the level of protection that scheme potentially will provide falls down to somewhere just below 20 year and maybe up to 100 year, depending on which climate change scenario you look at. So over the next 100 years, there's an incredible challenge as the scheme standards are effectively eroded away by climate change from, in this instance, something like a 440-year return period level of protection, potentially down to 20. You've also got those ecological changes and the challenges that people have. This is a graphic, again, using the Hutt River because it's local for us, what it looked like in 1847, and a very rapid progression from what was a fully vegetative floodplain through to a highly populated, highly urbanised, highly industrialised floodplain. Similar story at the mouth of the Hutt River, even in the 30s, what was quite an extensive estuary network that you can see there, flowing out into the sea. By the time we got to 2000s, reclamation's gone on, huge amount of industrial development along the sides of the river, and there's only a very small path out for the river. And as a regional council, we're basically committed to having to use extraction methods through that mouth to make sure that we can maintain a good flow out to the sea. People's expectations changing very rapidly as well. This one shows that in the 1900s, when the scheme was first built, people were quite happy with a 50-year level of protection. They thought that was actually pretty good. But by the time they got through to the 50s and they were starting to go through a great development phase and building all those state houses that we look at today, they decided that perhaps they'd better upgrade it to a 1 in 100-year level of protection. About 50 years on from there, we did another assessment and working through and coming up with a different level of protection required, and communities really demanding now that 500-year level of protection. Where's that going to go to in the future? It's going to be quite a challenge for us because you won't be able to continue to just keep on chopping up those Stopbanks to provide that higher and higher standard of protection. The other ones, some of the geomorphological changes that are going on as well. This is a tributary from the hills that flows into Lake Wairarapa. The delta that you see down in front of there, it's built up about 80 hectares in the last 45 years, 50 years. And then if you look at a cross-section of that, the amount of material that's come through there, you can see the Stopbanks on either side, but the amount of material that's built up between those Stopbanks is basically perched that river, and it's about a metre above the general ground level out to that true right-hand side. So, and most rivers, whether it's as graphic as that, but most rivers will have that same challenge down at those in those lower areas. So the response then came. So the next section on this little presentation, how did the river managers respond to that? We're working through what we've defined as a 5-year improvement or 5-year development plan, focusing on 4 key areas, and one of those was seeking government to come back to the table and help with the management of these flood protection schemes. So we divided that up into those 4 different sort of strategies. One was that strategy and collaboration and working together across the sector, and that's where that government part comes to play. The other part was looking at our practices, methodologies and standards, and some of those are in the geomorphological areas that you could talk about there. Others would be in the field of the standards that we actually build our Stopbanks to. Again, if you've seen the video and the way these things were built, they were very much earth embankments built up, but they are now really dams of a sort. They only temporarily have water behind them, and they protect an incredibly valuable part of New Zealand. To some degree, some of our design standards haven't kept up to the same sort of level of the risk that exists behind those, and we need to do quite a lot of work to improve those. Quality people side of it, the changes that have gone on over the years have meant that there haven't been nearly as many people coming into that river management sector. Quite a range of us are nearer the 60 to 70 end of their careers rather than at the beginning. And there's a real need for engaging through the universities and through the different avenues to get more people involved. And the 4th area we put up there was this engagement, communications and enabling environment. I think once people get to understand what it's all about, they're generally very, very supportive. But we don't do a very good job as river managers of making sure we maintain that engagement and bring people along with us. So we've got quite a lot of work to do there. So we put forward a case to government as to one of those sectors was about co-investment. And again, the little video is not going to work here. So putting it up, this is the case that we put to central government to co-invest in river management for flood protection. Put that in there and started articulating it with the various arms of government and politicians in 2018, and have been working through quite constantly since then with them. You'll see there we've got every regional council and unitary authority in the country listed down there, as well as that support from Local Government New Zealand and the regional sector of local government. So a good level of support. The story's good. People are saying just get in behind it. Some of that justification for that co-investment was really around the fact that flooding is New Zealand's single biggest natural hazard. It will be the one that catches everybody out and will cause the greatest issues when we have these major floods and the potential for succession of more and more floods. It really is a national issue. Right now, the Crown assets, all of the roading networks, the rail networks, or other infrastructure, the communications networks, schools, hospitals, all those things, they don't pay anything towards the management of these river schemes. And in a lot of cases, it's actually the landowners really just directly beside those rivers that are paying all of those costs. And yes, they receive a lot of benefit, but when you look at the value that the schemes offer that are way beyond the immediate landowners on either side, there's a real case for the Crown to come back and start funding these schemes. So where we're at the moment, those schemes were built in the 50s, and there's a real need for a step change in how we go about doing that management to lift the level of protection that the schemes provide, and to do it in a way that's much more in keeping or up to date with that wider spectrum of community expectations, whether it's through environmental, whether it's through cultural, or even the economic expectations. We really need to do a step change through there to get the government on board with that. So how has the government responded to that? It has been very positive. But in the end, along came COVID-19, which in some ways was a distraction for us and not really going to get us to the end game that we want to. But in other ways, it put up a whole lot of money that the government wants to spend to create jobs and stimulate the economy. So the River Managers Group, through that shutdown period, put together a package of nearly $400 million worth of works that we thought were shovel ready and could help the government in its objective of creating jobs and improving resilience and starting that step change towards improving our flood resilience. The government ran its ruler over that, and one of those rulers was that it wanted stuff that was able to be started by November 2020, so we are only talking a few months away from here now. And came back to us and said, well, yes, we're prepared to fund about $300 million worth of that, of the works, or works to the value of $300 million, and they were prepared to put in $210 million towards that. So where we've got to is Shane Jones, who was that Minister for Infrastructure, has agreed that through government that they will put in that $210 million, and this is out of a $3 billion sum set aside for infrastructure. So given the scale of flood protection within that, Three Waters and the various other pieces of infrastructure that are out there, we think we've done pretty well. This press release is one of the most recent ones that's come out, and it's talked more specifically, rather than that national picture of $210 million, it's talked about of that specifically in the Southland and Otago area. There's $30 million worth of projects, or $30 million of funding that the Crown's putting into projects in those areas. Of that, it's about $5 million for Otago and $25 million for Southland. So the recent floods in Southland certainly promoted a need to promote and put some more money into there. So there's a succession of press releases that are coming out over a period of time. Since that one, we've had one for Northland after that very wet weekend they had a few weeks ago, and Bay of Plenty will be announced today, I understand it, and then there'll be some further announcements where you would imagine that they will have announced how that $210 million is being spread around the country. Within 1 or 2 weeks, the House rises in a week, so I'm assuming that it'll be pretty much all announced by then, but it's dissolved by the 12th of August, so that's the last possible date. So by the 12th of August, we should have a bit more clarity about all of the different projects across the whole country that the government has agreed to fund. So that's a quick run through of the status that we're up to, and in particular in relation to these shovel-ready projects and flood protection.